Hello. We come to Class 14, Councils and Controversies, 327 to 361 AD, which is the second stage of the long struggle that we call the Arian controversy. Just FYI, 327 is the death of Constantine, after which, of course, things begin to be more flexible because Constantine himself was committed to the Nicene Council. And 361 is the death of Julian, the accession of Julian the Apostate, who was the last member of Constantine's family to rule, but had been raised in the church, but had reverted to paganism, and so rules as a pagan emperor for about 2.5 years, 361 to 363. In 327, things start moving around again because Constantine is no longer holding things in a kind of stasis which he had done after the Nicene Council. And in 361, things start moving around again because Julian, who wanted, as far as we can tell, to do as much harm to the church as he could, he tried very hard to disadvantage the church in very interesting ways because he was raised in the church and he was intelligent and intellectual academic. He left 3 volumes of written works in the Low Classical Library, among other things. He was very intelligent about the way he went after the church. One of the things he did was he prohibited Christians from being involved in public education, from teaching non-Christians. He said you can't teach classical literature because you don't believe in the gods, so therefore if you teach classical literature you're being hypocritical. And he also said that Christians were not allowed to use classical literature even in their own education. So even if a Christian household were to hire, or buy a tutor for the children, and then set the tutor to teaching them, the tutor would not be allowed to use classical Greek literature or Latin literature because to do so would be hypocritical. So very interestingly, this is one of the things that I would like to find is Apollinaris, who gets into trouble Christologically, and his father Apollinaris, who were 2 great early Christian intellectuals, began to write paraphrases of Scripture cast in the classical literary form. So they were doing things like versions of the books of Kings in the same meter as Homer, appropriate for military things. None of this stuff survives, of course, because the need for it disappeared, but it would be very interesting to see what they did. Anyway, that that there's, as an Anglican you should know, that the early English church liked to translate the Bible into its own language, and King Alfred the Great did some of that, and also into its own literary forms. And there are some sort of heroic, there's a which I have never read. I don't read Anglo-Saxon, but there is sort of a heroic paraphrase of one of the Gospels, I can't remember which, in Anglo-Saxon, where Jesus is kind of a Nordic hero, which is an interesting idea. If we were doing Christology, we could talk about that because that idea comes back actually more than once. But anyway, for now we're stuck in the 300s, and so we'll deal with that. What I have tried to do by my selections this time is this is a period of many councils held in different places at different times, sometimes quite consciously to counter other councils that had been previously held. People called together meetings of bishops in order to have them vote things that disagree with what earlier groups of bishops had voted. We are not able to put these councils completely in order let alone date them. You can have them in the right order without knowing the dates, right? I mean, off the top of my head, right? The fall of Byzantium comes before the Declaration of Independence. So even if I don't know the date of either one, I can properly put them in order. It's harder to know the dates, right? But we can neither know the dates of all these councils nor the order. And as a matter of fact, as Hall's book is quite clear, we're not always absolutely certain that a council actually took place. There are some councils that we have some evidence that people were calling them, but you can call a meeting and cancel it, or you can call a meeting and have no one come. So there's a lot we don't know about this period. But we do know that this is a period in which, generally speaking, all of these terms are, everyone fights about everything. Okay, but from what the people who, from our point of view, are sort of moderate Arians, they were pretty much in charge politically at this point, and so they were able to, throw people out of their diocese, like Athanasius. Everyone always throws Athanasius out, and put their own people in. If you are interested particularly in this stage of things, the collection of articles, Arianism After Arius, also the book by Gwyn, The Eusebians, and also Sarah Parvis's book, Marcellus of Ancyra and the Lost Years of the Arian Controversy, 325 to 345. Those are all books that relate specifically to this period as opposed to the broader scheme. What I will try to say a few basic things in Hall, about Hall, and then we'll look at the primary sources we have for this time, of which there are tons. It would be very useful to look, for example, at all of the creeds of Antioch, and about which everyone fights, and try to say something about how they differ and stuff, and we'll do a little of that this time. One of the things you need to develop if you want to understand this period is an ability to read some of these statements of faith and not only understand what the creed itself actually says, which is difficult enough, but also to be enough aware of what's going on so that you can identify what the creed is not saying, what the creed is not talking about, right? If you pay attention to American politics, then you notice oftentimes what the candidates are not saying more than what they are saying. But a foreigner might not notice that, right? And so might not understand what's really going on. If we're to really understand these councils and their statements of faith, and where people's thinking was, then we need to understand the way they express themselves and also what's on their mind. One of the things which is very clear about the Arian controversy is that before it all begins, before Alexander of Alexandria and Arius get into it, right, as people would say, and after the whole thing, which, as we said last time, might be 381, or it might be 451, or it might be 787, or it might be 1985, depending on when you think the whole conversation is over. And many people, myself among them, think the conversation's never really over, but it definitely quiets down. Well, the Christological conversation doesn't really quiet down ever, because we still have churches that are separated on Christological grounds, because all the non-Chalcedonian churches come from that. So I would have to say that in the strictest sense, this conversation has never calmed down. But anyway, after this whole process, when people sit down to write a creed, they have different things in mind about what they're trying to say. They have different expectations. Someone listening to a creed or reading a creed is looking for different things after this whole process than before. And also the words that get used are changed, and also some of the meanings of the words get changed too. And all of these things are very important for our understanding these creeds, but also the creeds that we use now, but also, and importantly, the creeds that were used before this. You cannot read, for example, what we call the Apostles' Creed, right, which is not the Apostles' Creed, but anyway, what we call the Apostles' Creed, you cannot read through post-Nicene eyes. You have to read the Nicene Creed, which is also not the Nicene Creed, right? It's the Constantinopolitan Nicene Creed. More about that in 2 weeks. You cannot read our Nicene Creed through the same eyes as you read our Apostles' Creed, because they come from different circumstances and different ages as far as this conversation goes. So you cannot expect them to say the same things in the same words, and that's very important. Just because you can print them on the same page, which the prayer book does, doesn't mean they are equivalent, okay, because they're not. Okay, so let's look at this. Quickly. Constantine dies. Things settle down a little bit. One of the basic things going on, beginning here on page 139, is the division between the Latin-speaking parts of the empire and the Greek-speaking parts of the empire as far as theology is concerned. You will notice during the course of this controversy that when someone from the east, like Athanasius, gets in trouble, they send him to the west. And when they send him to Trier, which is a Latin-speaking place. And when someone in the west gets in trouble, like Hilary of Poitiers, they send him to the east. This is because that removes him from his circle of friends and circle of acquaintances. It makes him more difficult to make trouble. One of the things this highlighted to the people at that time as well as to us is that there were different conversations going on about these things in Latin and in Greek. There is a deep sense in which it is true that the real burden of the conversation is happening in Greek. This is why Greek is the Christian theological language, much more so than Latin. Latin's not really an important theological language. I would say by the time Latin kicks in, all the good stuff's done. But anyway, Greek is the language of the creeds and of this argument. And the Latin speakers, like Leo the Great, are, however well educated and philosophically astute they might be, they are just not up on what the conversation actually is in Greek and how the words are used, things like that. One of the reasons why Hilary of Poitiers is coming to be recognized as an absolutely crucial figure in all of this is that he was a very well-educated and theologically adept Latin speaker who was sent to the East and became completely au courant with what was going on in Greek and seems to have been able to speak and read Greek well enough so he could enter into this. And then when he came back, he wrote works in Latin that made a lot of the Greek stuff available to people in Latin. Hilary's very important for this. You would do well to read Hilary of Poitiers' book on the Trinity, which is much less well known than, say, Augustine's book on the Trinity. It's very important. Just as a note, Thomas Torrance, the great Scottish theologian who was also the moderator of the Church of Scotland, a rare case of the head of a church being a big-time theologian, who just died very recently, less than 10 years ago, I think, for decades taught doctrine, what we would call, I guess, dogmatic theology at the University of Edinburgh. And his central text that he used for that class was Hilary of Poitiers on the Trinity in Latin. Couldn't do that these days. But of course, he only died. He only died 10 years ago. Scotland's, it's cold and wet, and people stay inside and learn Latin. But anyway, that shows how broad the coverage of the work is, and also how important it is for drawing out what's going on in the tradition. It's available in all in English in the Fathers of the Church series. You can buy it. It's in print. So I recommend that to you. But one of the things to be aware of always is the distinction between Latin and Greek, the different conversations. It is not true that all of the Arians are in the Greek-speaking world. As a matter of fact, Arianism seems to survive explicitly in the Latin-speaking world for centuries after it dies off in Greek. Part of that is because the barbarian nations the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals and all of those, the Lombards, all those wonderful people who come raping and pillaging down into the Roman Empire and all the way down into North Africa, they arrive as Arian Christians. And so they keep Arianism going for centuries longer than it would have otherwise. But also because there seem to be inside the Roman world on the Latin side important people who were Arians for a very long time. People are still working on this, but it's a mistake to think that because what we look back on and identify as the major conversation is going on in Greek, that could make you think that the only conversation that's going on is Greek, and that's just not true. So during this period, what we're going to see is a growing realization on the part of people who are in favor of the Nicene Creed, right, and what it teaches. A growing realization that all of the people who are not comfortable with the Nicene Creed are not all the same. They're come to be identifiable what seems to have been, I mean, and this is always seems, right? What seems to have been a large group of people who were uncomfortable with the Nicene Creed because it was an innovation, and they thought that innovations were counter to the Christian approach, but were absolutely willing to accept its teaching. In other words, they had difficulties with the way the Nicene Creed spoke, but not difficulties with what the Nicene Creed said. And so we begin to get an awareness of the distinction between how people talk and what people say, and a beginning to think systematically about separating people's doctrine from their words, which is a tremendously important element in the development of Christian theology, and a tremendously important thing for Christian theologians ever since. If someone comes to you in a parish and says, you know, I don't like the creed, the first thing to ask them, of course, is not, to leave. The first thing to ask them is, what don't you like about it? We had several people in our parish who didn't like the creed. They didn't like the way it talked. Interestingly enough, they were much like these early people. They thought it was too philosophical and not scriptural enough. As a matter of fact, the creed's almost entirely scriptural, right? So you can sit down with people and show them how almost every phrase comes. But in terms of the way they think it's too philosophical, it became clear to me over time talking to these people that they had no hesitation about anything the creed said. They were just uncomfortable with the way it talked because it didn't talk the way they would talk if they were trying to say the same thing. And so we talked a little bit about how the creed is an ancient thing and all that kind of stuff. And we ended up happily with them staying, which is what you always hope for. That actually is a parallel to what eventually happens. It's important to know that three of the greatest Christian theologians ever, Basil of Caesarea, his little brother Gregory of Nyssa, and his buddy Gregory Nazianzus, were all apparently in this group. They were raised in this group who thought that the Nicene Creed was kind of questionable because of its language, and they were only very hesitant to come around to supporting it, not because of what it said, but because of how it said it. That's a very important thing to know, because they are the heart of the Christian theological mainstream. If the Cappadocian Fathers had trouble with stuff, then it's very traditional to have trouble with it. So people who have trouble with the wording of the creeds are not a problem. But that's a tremendous. That comes only as a result of dozens of prominent people arguing for decades about very particular points of doctrine and expression. One of the things that all people who are not theologians, beginning with Constantine, who says, this is a stupid minor problem, I want you to all cut it out, I'm going to have a meeting, you're all going to agree, and it's going to be over. Speaking for all laymen from every age, right? All of you theologians, just shut up. Everything was fine before this started. So let's just stop talking about it, and we'll go back to when things were fine. After decades of this discussion, people finally began to be able to see that there were different kinds of things going on. There were some arguments between groups of people who really did have radically different ideas about what they thought was true. And there were other groups of people who might be saying things in very different ways, but they were not necessarily disagreeing with others of the groups. In other words, there were sometimes language was a marker of substantive differences, and sometimes language was just a marker of linguistic differences. And it's very important to be able to tell the difference between that. And if the Arian controversy teaches you nothing else, I'll reiterate it again because I said it twice last week, but I'll say it again. It seems perfectly clear that before this breaks out into the open, Arius has been reading the same Bible and worshiping with the same worship services as everybody else, for example, his bishop Alexander, while having a completely different idea of what the church was actually teaching and preaching. In other words, the language they used before this began was not specific enough or well enough understood by everybody in order to make it impossible for two people with completely different ideas to buy into it. So in other words, up until then, the theological language was not serving its purpose. It was not expressing Christian teaching well enough for it to be actually sketching out the outlines of what the church wanted to say. This does not mean that everybody needs to use technical language, right, and confuse everybody with, these days, usually German terms, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to be able to explain what it is the church is trying to teach in a way that is clear enough so the people who hear you not only understand what you are saying, but also understand how it differs from other things you might have been saying. Right? It's easy to say something everyone makes sense of, right? God is love is a nice Bible quote, right? Every Christian would buy into God is love, right? But if you begin, say, the Oneida group in upstate New York, where they have group marriage and all this stuff because God is love, and this is an expression of what that means, then you're clearly showing that if you choose God is love as the only thing you say, that you are not saying enough in order to communicate the message that the church wants to communicate. The church does want to say that God is love, right? But the church does not want to say that and only that and have people run off in every imaginable direction with it. The church has to specify more closely what it is it actually means. I choose God is love because Archbishop Morris used to like to say, God is love is a definition of God, and I would have to say no. It's not a definition of God, and also even if it were, that's not enough. It's not a definition in the sense that he meant, that it was after you'd said that you were done. That's not true, because there's no such thing as a definition of God, because words are finite and God is infinite. So you cannot define God in any human language. More about that, the fathers also talked about that, which is an important point too. And that's something also to remember, which is that at the end of this whole thing, one of the great messages of the Arian controversy and of any theological controversy is it teaches the church that human language is always an inadequate tool when trying to speak the truth about God. You can say things that are completely true about God, like God is love. That is completely true, right? It's a scripture quote. We're absolutely committed to its truth entirely, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth about God is not expressible with human language. Because even if you were to say completely true things like God is love, right, forever, and you never repeated yourself, you would never express the completeness of what there is to say about God, because God is infinite, and you would always have said a fixed number of words. Say if you started now and spoke forever, you would always have said a fixed number of words, and God is infinite. There is no fixed number that can adequately express him, so therefore you never get there. Okay, that's worth knowing about. Okay, so those are very important points to keep in mind. I urge you to read all of the things in these sections in Creeds, Councils, and Controversies. It's a very useful collection of all these different creeds. By the way, there is a large project which is meant to be published by German scholars, but it's meant to be published in English by the Oxford University Press. It was announced as an ongoing project 5 years ago at the Oxford Conference. It's not done yet, but they're hoping it to be a collection of all of the creedal material that exists in Christian writing up to a certain point, and I can't remember what point. That was they were arguing about what point to stop, because of course the farther you go, the more there is. And I don't remember that they had come to a conclusion, so I can't tell you what the conclusion is. But that will be, when it's published, that will be the greatest collection of early Christian creedal material that exists. For now, this volume is as good as any for the early stuff. And so I urge you to take a look at it. It helps, of course, always to be able to look at the actual words, because after all, they're fighting over words. But that's more difficult than it should be. Okay, number 4, Julius of Rome on the exiled bishops. Because people are being sent away out of their jurisdictions, to the other half of the Roman world, and because at least for part of this period the empire is ruled by 2 emperors, one in the east and one in the west, and because even if the empire is only ruled by one emperor, still in one part of the empire he's close, and in the other part of the empire he's really far away. It's easier to defy the emperor if the emperor lives in Antioch and you are in Spain, than if the emperor lives in Rome and you are in Rome. That's a little bit riskier, right? So someone like Julius of Rome, who the bishops of Rome from a very early period loved to tell everybody what to do, but of course it's easier for him to tell people in the east what to do because they're far away, and so he can send off letters telling them what to do, and it's very difficult for us to know how these letters were received. By and large, in the early period, bishops of Rome are very ready to say, well, we as the leading church in the world tell you to do X. But they had very little luck getting anybody to do X. As a matter of fact, usually people would appeal to Rome, and they also appealed to other places too, but they would appeal to Rome when they had already lost somewhere else. And if Rome told them something they didn't want to hear, then they didn't appeal to them anymore. So it's not much of a papal system, in other words. Okay. Let us grant the removal, as you write, of Athanasius and Marcellus, that's Marcellus of Ancyra, right, from their places. Yet what must one say of the case of the other bishops and presbyters who, as I said before, came here from various places and complained that they had also been forced away? He's granting that the emperor himself has removed Athanasius and Marcellus, so he can't do much about that, right? But what about these other guys? Oh, dearly beloved, verse 5, line 5. The decisions of the church are no longer according to the gospel, but tend furthermore to banishment and death. Supposing, as you assert, that some offense rested upon these persons, the case ought to have been conducted against them, not after this manner, but according to the canon of the church. He is complaining, broadly speaking, that church matters have been swallowed up by civil procedure and civil legal situations. This is an argument that continues to the present day. Exactly how should church jurisdiction differ from civil jurisdiction? Both the Greek and the Latin world argue about this. The ideas change over time. They're never exactly the same in one place, even over time. But it's interesting to see that this is happening so early. So just as a note, the second paragraph here on page 6, why was nothing written to us concerning the church of the Alexandrians in particular? Are you ignorant that the custom has been for word to be written first to us, and then for a just sentence to be passed from this place? I can only say, having taken a course on the rise of the centrality of Rome in the church from a professor at a pontifical faculty at Catholic University, in other words, getting the ultimate Roman view of this, have to say that there's no sign at this point that anybody except for Julius thinks that there's a tradition that this is what happens. He seems to have the idea that the way it works is that everybody asks him first and he decides what goes on, but there doesn't seem to be any basis in the past that we're aware of for him to think this. It was true that Demetrius of Alexandria wrote him some letters telling him what was going on in his church. Hey, what's up in yours? Which we actually looked at in the New Eusebius. But that's very different from what he seems to be talking about. But this is evidence, first of all, of the fact. So what do we actually, if we're going to say Julius is talking through his hat, right? And this isn't. He's not being the Pope, the universal leader of the church. So what is this actually showing us, right? It's showing us, first of all, that a church leader in the West thinks of the difficulties that Marcellus and Athanasius and others are going through as being things that affect him. So there is a built-in sense of the unity and unicity, oneness of the church, which is very important to see. And also that one of the things one of the things that's going to be important as they go on is a question of jurisdiction. If they're going to have these arguments, who is going to be in charge of deciding who wins the arguments, what side is giving a better case, and who is going to be able to put that decision into effect? That is, through this whole thing, a very important factor. And if you look at what actually happens, as you can imagine, everybody fights about this too, right? If you look at what actually happens, it seems clear that the emperors push this process all the way up to and beyond the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The emperors push this process, but they tried to do it through the bishops. In other words, the emperors tried to get the bishops to say what the emperors want them to say, and generally the emperors want whatever's going to make everything settle down. There are some emperors who have actual theological, money in the game, but most emperors are interested in peace, not doctrinal purity, as far as we can tell, which isn't all that far. Okay, the Council of Sardica is very important for the growth of councils as church law-creating things. What's really interesting about the Council of Sardica here is that there is a clear sense at this point in the minds of the emperors that the church is divided. And so at Sardica, which is in Serbia, I think now, used to, when there was Yugoslavia, it was easier. It was in Yugoslavia. I can't remember which little piece it's in, but it was in Yugoslavia. So in the Balkans, right where the dividing line between Greek and Latin is, the idea was that there would be a double council. There would be the Latin, rather than having people in the West and people in the East talk about this. They would get everybody together and talk about it in one central place. The problem was it was all bound up with people being sent on exile places, and Marcellus and Athanasius had managed to convince the Westerners, the important Westerners, that they had been mistreated and that their teaching was the proper teaching, and that they had been unjustly deposed. So when the Latin-speaking bishops showed up, they brought with them Marcellus and Athanasius as a part of their group as bishops. And the Eastern bishops, who had been chosen by the Arian emperor Constantius, they didn't want to have anything to do with Marcellus and Athanasius. They said because they had been deposed, but I think really because they had different theological ideas. And so rather than there getting to be a big council together, the Latin bishops wouldn't give up on Marcellus and Athanasius, and the Greek bishops wouldn't sit at a council with them. So they had simultaneous separate councils and gave their own statements of faith, and so there never was an opportunity to get everybody together. So one of the things we see there is that the telling of the story begins to be important. This begins to be why someone like Athanasius writes a work called The History of the Arians, and a work called Apology, about things that he's doing, and he also writes books, orations against the Arians, which try to lay out the theology of all of this. This idea that explaining to people what's actually going on and where you fit in it is very important, is one of the motives actually for producing early histories of the church. Theodoret, Socrates, and Sozomen, who write important church histories. Just on this page, we're looking at 7 and 8, right? 7 comes from Socrates' church history, and 8 comes from Theodoret's church history, right? These are 2 of those 3. They begin to write, they're all Nicenes. They write later in the 400s, but they write with this idea in mind that telling the story of how all of this works is how you're going to make people actually understand what's going on. And Athanasius is the first person who does this, which may be one of the reasons why he ends up being such an influential writer, because he's laying out for people what's really at stake in ways that they can understand. Okay, so the doctrinal statement of the Western Council of Sardica. This is mainly Latin. This is Latin-speaking people at this council. So we're getting there. You're getting a slightly different view. Okay, let's look at what they say here quickly. We could spend 3 hours just on this page and a half. Okay, he says they're complaining about Ursacius and Valens, who are prominent Latin-speaking Arians. It says they maintain, here opposite 39, that the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are of diverse and distinct hypostases. Remember again, the Latin word substance is an exact linguistic equivalent of the Greek word hypostasis. So to Latin people, saying different hypostases sounds like you're saying different substances. This is the case where they use their language exactly oppositely. But they are onto something here correctly, which is that the Arians want to say, as we said before, that if you draw a bright line between God and the world, you write Father, and then you draw a line, and everything else is underneath. So the Son and the Spirit, they would actually like to draw a bright line under Son and have the Spirit be 3 different things, a descending Trinity. And the Nicenes want to have Father, Son, and Spirit at the same level. How do they do this? Right? The Nicene people want to say at the very bottom of page 15, if it were asked what is the hypostasis of the Son, We confess it is the same as the sole hypostasis of the Father. They're not saying they're the same thing. They're not using the language the way Greek people would. They're saying they're the same substance. They're the same, the same stuff. They're both fully divine. The Father has never been without the Son, nor the Son without the Father, nor is it possible that what is Word is Spirit. They don't want to say the Word is the Spirit or the Spirit is the Word. They're three, not two. So that is an argument for full divinity, not identity. That's why you have to try to figure out what they're saying. If a Greek person said the Father and the Son are the same hypostasis, they would be saying they're the same person. But for a Latin person at this point to say it, they mean they're the same essence, right? So it's actually a statement of homoousios, though that isn't the word they're using. So at the top of 16, it is most absurd to affirm that the Father ever existed without the Son, for this could never be the case. That this could never be the case has been testified by the Son himself. I am in the Father, and the Father in me, and the Father and I are one. Look at the next paragraph under 42. If he had had a beginning, that's the Son, he could not have always existed, for the ever-existent Word does not have a beginning. God will never have an end. We do not say that the Father is the Son, nor that the Son is the Father, but that the Father is the Father, the Son is the Son of the Father. Okay, so if it's not possible for him to ever have had a beginning, and if the Father is the Father of the Son and the Son is the Son of the Father, they relate as fathers and sons relate, this is a statement of a belief in eternal generation, right? That is the idea that they're holding in their mind here. So the idea of the beginning of the generation of the Son is what they are objecting to, because that means that the God, if the Father was not always begetting the Son, then there was a time or situation in which the Father himself alone was God. That's what they're objecting to. That's the vision of the Trinity that they're objecting to. And that seems to be the vision of the Trinity that the Arians are upholding, because they want to insist that the Son is subsequent, both logically and essentially from the Father. Okay, let's look at the Creed of Jerusalem now. This is interesting. Roughly during this same period, the Bishop of Jerusalem, Cyril, Jerusalem became, after the legalization of Christianity, right? Jerusalem became a place that people liked to go for pilgrimage for Easter. People also like to go and get baptized there because, that's a good religious thing to do on your pilgrimage. And so the Bishop of Jerusalem would give catechetical lectures explaining Christian doctrine to large groups of people who would come and spend, the last few weeks before Easter. If you could afford to, you'd spend all of Lent in Jerusalem and then get baptized and, celebrate. And if you could, stay till Pentecost and then go home. And so Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem became famous for giving these lectures that that were very well received, full expressions of Christian doctrine, and he has stuff about the liturgy and stuff. These lectures actually survive from the ancient world, and they can be read. They have very important information about what Christians were actually doing. It's still a time before written services, what Christians actually did, but also Christian doctrine. What's really interesting is, of course, in the lead up to baptism, and then in the instruction after baptism, the phrases of the creed come out, because he explains to them the creed that they're going to use for baptizing, so then when they assent to it, they know what they're agreeing to, right? So he preaches sermons on these things. These are wonderful stores of Christian teaching, and I would really advise you to read them if you can. They're fully, I believe they're fully translated into English. So this creed is put together from these different lectures that, he gives you little phrases. They're put together from the lecture, so it's a scholar's gathering of material and putting it into creedal form. This is not the way he actually says it. He never actually says this, right? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, in one Lord Jesus Christ. What's interesting about this is that this creed is not produced in the context of the argument. This creed is produced in the context of worship, where he's just explaining what the church teaches to people. So it's a rare chance, we hope, of seeing what someone would say when he's not fighting about it, right? What did people actually say in this time? The 340s are when his lectures come from. In one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, who was begotten from the Father as true God before all ages. The before all ages means before all other things created, he is begotten. The strongest thing here is true God. To say he is begotten from the Father as God before all ages could mean almost anything. It would mean he's not a creature in the middle, created in the middle of the other creatures, but he could be a creature before. But if he's begotten as true God, then that's a very different thing to say. This seems to be parallel to the true God from true God phrase in the Nicene Creed. Right? Through whom all things came into being, he's the agent of creation himself, who was incarnate, became man, was crucified, buried, rose again from the dead on the third day, is coming to judge. So in the whole first thing, the only real tip-off word is the true before God, and that's tremendously important. It seems to mean, scholars, I don't know of any scholar who doesn't agree, looking back, that Cyril, who was not much of a fighter, he's not really involved in all this stuff, he's got other problems, right? He's just being a bishop. But Cyril seems to have been agreeing with the Nicene Creed in terms of content, right? So we would call him a Nicene Christian, though he is, of course, not using the Nicene Creed, he's using his own creed. Then if you turn over, as they say, it's very interesting to see at the top of page 26, in one Holy Spirit, the Paraclete who spoke in the prophets, in one baptism of repentance to the remission of sins, one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. It sounds very much like the end of the Apostles' Creed, right? Which, just as a quick note, the Apostles' Creed seems to be descended from or a very close relative of the traditional baptismal creed of Rome. It seems to be a Western thing, but of course not a Latin thing, because they're worshiping in Greek in Rome in the early period, or Aramaic. I think the earliest. That's a specialty that I don't have. I don't know if the earliest version of the Apostles' Creed we have is in Latin or not. Logically, it should be in Greek, but I don't know off the top of my head. We do have early ones in Latin. I think we have early ones in Greek too. Okay. That gets us to. So we've seen a little bit about some of the practical difficulties of getting bishops together, and we've seen a little bit of the difficulty about figuring out exactly what people are saying, the slipperiness of words like hypostasis. If you learn what hypostasis means in the Nicene Creed, it does not mean that you can take that and plug it in to another creed even from the same period, because exactly what that word ought to mean and whether or not you ought to use it is precisely what they're fighting about, right? So it's very easy to misunderstand these things. Okay. Liberius is not playing along with the emperor, and as we said, it's easier to not play along with the emperor if you're far, far away, but it doesn't mean that it lasts forever. Liberius gets deposed from the Roman Church. Okay, here in number 11, and on page 38, it's selection 22, but number 11 on the side. Liberius, for the above reason, was deposed from the Roman Church. Its government was transferred to Felix, a deacon of the clergy there. It is said that Felix always continued in adherence to the Nicene faith, that his conduct in religious matters was blameless. This is a Nicene guy looking back. The only thing alleged against him was that prior to his ordination he held communion with the heterodox. There may have been non-Nicenes who were part of the church in Rome at this point, and Felix may have been, from a parish church that included some of those people. Rome is, one of the things that shows us is Rome is far enough away, and it's different enough, so that the emperor in Constantinople throws out the Bishop of Rome because he's given him trouble over all this creed stuff, but the guy he selects has the same ideas as the guy he threw out. In other words, he doesn't have enough control at that distance or have people in the palace with enough knowledge to be able to locate someone in Rome who actually agrees with what the emperor is trying to put forward. So he ends up getting rid of one guy, but he doesn't solve his problem from the point of view of the emperor. Okay. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind. 23, the attempted arrest of Athanasius. This is one of my favorite stories. I just actually was reading a book about councils in the church, and this was mentioned. I chose these because both of these selections, 22 and 23, give you some sense of the interaction between the church and the civil authorities, right? The civil authorities are trying to control what the church does. They try to do that by controlling who's in charge of the church in key places. And they do that not by getting them all together and trying to convince the ones who are there of new ideas, but rather by getting rid of them and trying to get someone else in. It doesn't work in Rome. Athanasius, who was exiled 4 or 5 times during his life by all sorts of different emperors for all sorts of different reasons, is a particularly difficult case. Egypt is a particularly sort of difficult situation anyway. It's very different from the other parts of the empire, and it feels very different from the other parts of the empire, and the emperors never really understand the Egyptians. And but anyway, this is a famous time when the new governor comes, and he puts troops all around the church, and they're at a worship service, and Athanasius is inside leading the service. He doesn't want to. The governor doesn't want to cause a riot and end up slaughtering a bunch of people in the church, making martyrs of them, because that will just make things worse from the government's point of view, right? And also at this point, a lot of the people in the empire are getting to be Christian, so that the troops may have Christian. There may be among the troops Christians who would not be willing to go into a church and slaughter people. In the same way that if you remember Boris Yeltsin standing on the tank in Moscow, where the Politburo sent the tanks in to conquer Moscow, and he went out and stood on the top of the first tank and gave a speech to the soldiers, and the soldiers wouldn't fire on the crowd anymore, and that's when the Soviet Union was really done with, because their weapon of repression wouldn't work for them anymore. They surround the church with Athanasius in it. He doesn't want the crowd harmed, so he says, well, we'll sing a psalm while they leave. And the people with Athanasius somehow hustle him out of the church in the middle of the crowd, and he gets out. What's really interesting about this exile is, during this exile, which is a number of years long, 3 or 4 years anyway, Athanasius does not leave Egypt. And so what happens is the government brings in another guy to sit on the episcopal throne and protect with soldiers and stuff. But Athanasius remains in hiding for the whole time. The army's looking for him with great zeal, and they can never find him. And Athanasius manages not only to stay in Egypt, but to still administer the diocese while he's being hunted by the imperial troops, and so the men that they sent in to be the new patriarch of Alexandria doesn't really have anything to do. No, he can't get anyone to listen to him. It's a very interesting case of the difficulty that the Roman government had in getting people to do what they wanted them to do. The Roman government, they could massacre people, but they couldn't really do much more than that. They didn't have fine-tuned control of situations. So, anyway, we'll look at a couple more things here. Let's look at problems about the homoousios. Let me tell you something about this before. I spoke last time about the fact that homoousios was targeted by Arius himself as being an unacceptable term to use of the Son, and that seems to be why homoousios was put in the Creed at Nicaea, because they knew that Arius would not sign it if they put it in. And the point of the Creed at Nicaea was to have something Arius wouldn't sign. That's what they were trying to devise. However, one of the real difficulties with that is that Paul of Samosata, Samosata, in the 250s, who was the bishop of Palmyra, the place with the beautiful ruins that just got destroyed by ISIS last year, was put on trial for clerical misbehavior in the 250s. And there was a council that met, and we know something of some of the discussion that took place. And the council was very concerned about his theological ideas. And they, in the course of this discussion, they tried to ask him how he would talk about the Son and his relationship to the Father. And Paul said, well, there are some people around who talk about the Son and the Father as saying, as if they were homoousios. And he says, as if they were, he says, which is how you talk about pennies when you stamp them out of copper, right? The ousia is copper, and if you stamp two pennies out, they are homoousios with each other because they're both made out of copper, right? And is that what you want me to say, says Paul, and all the bishops go, eek, because of course that's a physical image that they exactly don't want to use of God. They don't want to say anything physical about God. So the council fathers say, no, that's exactly, we don't want to say that about God. Homoousios is a word that should never be used about God, they say. That's the only prominent theological use of homoousios that we know of before the Nicene period. So when the Nicene Creed comes out and it's got homoousios in it, of course Arius doesn't sign it because he's already said he wouldn't sign it because that's a stupid way of talking about God and the Son. But a lot of these other people won't sign it either, because the only time it's ever been used is by Paul of Samosata as an example of what we don't want to say about God, and that council had said, we should never use that term. That the term homoousios should not be used in theology in the church anymore, is what they say. And so there are people who object to homoousios because they're like Arius, but there are also people who object to homoousios because they're traditional Christians and they don't want to say anything physical about God. So this is when Athanasius is talking about homoousios, he's got these two things in mind. Homoousios is for people who want to agree with the creed, with what the creed says. Homoousios is a very awkward word. That's why I said last time it's not accurate and it's not useful to teach the Nicene Creed keying on homoousios. That's not the key of the Nicene Creed. It was actually one of the things that made it very difficult for the Nicene Creed to be used and passed on down. So we need to realize that it's the total meaning. As a matter, just as a to end up where we started, the Cappadocian Fathers resist for more than a decade, agreeing to the Nicene Creed, though they completely agree with its teaching, right? Because of course this is before the Nicene Creed is used. It's a council document at this point, right? They resist the Nicene Creed because they know the story about Paul of Samosata, and because they know that council specifically forbade the use of homoousios when talking about God. It's a very difficult argument to make to get traditional, what we would call Catholic Christians, to be willing to sign a creed that uses the word homoousios, because it was there were not too many words that had been specifically rejected by the tradition before then, but homoousios was one of them, and that makes things very difficult. Because the fight in the we're going to have to come to an end here, but just before we have a whole nother week before we get to the Council of Constantinople. And so I want to say, because generally in the Arian controversy, the argument comes down to, do you want to say the Son is like the Father or not? And if you want to say the Son is like the Father, how do you want to say he's like the Father? Much of the argument deals with likeness, and so, which is homoios, and so people fight over homoousios, homoiousios, homoion, like all of the word homoousios and words related to it get caught up in the argument about the different ways that people want to express what they think is true about God and the Son, God the Father and God the Son, but which gives some usefulness to looking back, for people like us to look back and say, we know that the right answer is homo, and we want to see how they find their way there. But you cannot think that any of the people at the time are thinking that, because there just isn't any evidence of it. Athanasius himself takes a long time to come around to homoousios as being a useful word. He seems to stay away from it for several decades at least before he begins to use it late in his life. So we don't have time to do the anhomoians, the unlikers, but we can either talk about that next time or go directly to the towards synthesis. I hope this isn't too confusing. There are a lot of different moving parts, but that's okay, because at this point, from 327 to 361, there should be a lot of different moving parts. So if that's the impression you're getting, then you are up to speed as far as that period goes. We've got another time next time to begin to see some things sift out. And then 2 weeks from today, we can hope to get a little closure. Thank you very much.